My mom was married for 70 years. 70 years. My dad died in June. She is bereft. One of the things she often says these days is, I don't know where he is. He's lost. I can't find him anywhere. It's a cry from the heart, an expression of her profound grief at the loss which has broken 70 years of relationship. And it is a loss that is measured, created by the depth of that relationship. Without that love, that connection, that friendship for so many years, the loss would not be as great. So the loss itself is an expression of the love that was the center of her life and that spilled over like an unending stream to her children and her grandchildren and every person she knew. It's that love, those loving relationships that create the ability in her to survive and even to thrive during this time of grief, and to give her the courage to continue. She is surrounded by children who love her, who call her, by grandchildren who visit or call. She is surrounded by friends who are still there for her, even after so many years. She has not only the memories from her 70-year-old marriage, but also all those connections that arose from that long-term and loving relationship, from that experience of knowing she is loved and believing that she is lovable. It is that knowledge, that belief, that causes the spirit to flourish and enables people to overcome even the most desperate challenges of life. It's an ancient spiritual teaching. When we know we are loved and know we are lovable, the fruits of the Spirit are that we feel affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity. We develop a willingness to stick with tasks and relationships, to work things out, and a belief that we can work things out. When we know we are loved, we find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way in life, and we live with compassion and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates all things and all people. Ancient spiritual wisdom from the Christian scriptures, Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. The world is filled with suffering, but the world is also filled with overcoming. And overcoming may be less visible than the suffering, but overcoming is all around us. And that ability to overcome is rooted in positive relationships, in love. And today, 2,000 years later, we now know that that's not only a spiritual teaching to the delight of my loving but truly geeky heart. It's also evidence-based. The importance of relationship has been proven in studies emerging in the healthcare field. Now, healthcare is complicated and it's polarizing. We look at our national scene and it is amazing how a complicated issue can be oversimplified once it gets polarized. But beneath the noise of that public debate and that polarization, there are many groups who are working to understand the ways that we can promote health in all of us. And one of those studies is the ACE study, this study on adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences are 10 categories of really terrible experiences that fall loosely into 3 areas: abuse, whether physical or verbal, and absence of a parent, and various kinds of neglect. And the impact on health of these early childhood experiences is now understood to be clearly connected to disease, killer disease, later in life. It puts people, if people have more than 3 of the 10 adverse childhood experiences, it puts them at 100-fold risk of diseases like heart disease and diabetes, and a 1,200-fold risk of committing suicide. This seems like such an intractable problem, even in itself, that we discover this impact on health of these early experiences that we can't go back in time to change. And yet, there has emerged an understanding that even minute interventions can make a difference in the health of people who have multiple adverse childhood experiences. Kaiser Permanente did a study with 100,000 patients. One of the first things they did was start collecting information on patients' adverse childhood experiences. And then they made this one small intervention. The doctor looked at the form and said, "I see you've had these terrible experiences during your childhood. Tell me." Now, later in life, what do you think is the impact of that early experience? That's it, just a question, not counseling, not follow-up, no group support, no therapy, but just that small question. One person asking another person about their experience and how it's affecting them today resulted in a 35% decline in the need for doctor visits over the next year, and a 3% decline in hospitalization rates over the next year. These are people who are most at risk for the diseases that kill. And this tiny little question made a significant difference. One crucial lesson of the ACE study is that there's work being done that's not visible in the national public policy debates. There's hope that's not visible. There's an invitation to begin improving healthcare now, even though we haven't solved the bigger problems that occupy that public stage. And it's in the impact of the relationship-based interventions. Now, this is where I have to talk about Cheerios. So Cheerios, this is another one of my theories, not exactly proven by science, but it's based on science. If you take a bowl and put water in it and sprinkle in a few Cheerios, you can try this at home. You'll discover that the Cheerios float and that after a few minutes, they start to clump together. They're attracted to each other. They're in relationship with one another until they form a little community. And this is the way human beings are. Human beings are like Cheerios. They want to be in community. They want to be in relationship. I better not take that metaphor much farther. But it is the way we are as human beings. And there are people out there communities and groups that are finding ways to overcome seemingly impossible challenges by creating small interventions based on relationships. And these are more and more evidence-based interventions, like the Kaiser Permanente study, that improve health outcomes. They're shifting the paradigm of healthcare all below the radar, from a business-based, assembly line treatment of human beings to a relationship-based treatment. Some of these interventions are a network of community nurses who actually visit people in their homes, a community-based postnatal support groups that emphasize child development for the first year of the child's life, physicians who encourage cardiac patients to meditate and to develop closer personal relationships, entire medical practices that place an emphasis on doctor-patient relationships, and faith-based efforts that harness the power of the church community or the synagogue, the mosque, the temple community to make sure community members are supported in accessing health care. Isn't this what the church is supposed to do? We're supposed to be community for one another. We're supposed to reach out to the wider community and offer our love and support and connection. These lessons that are emerging in healthcare are all about the importance of relationships in overcoming health challenges, and they also apply to other areas of suffering and challenge. Think for a minute about immigration and refugees and the sanctuary movement, of which this congregation is a part. In this area, so often we focus on the headlines, but our world is filled with overcoming through the actions of communities like ours that are willing to reach out and invite a family into sanctuary. And we can see the importance of the creation of relationships between the congregation members and the sanctuary family. We can see the importance of relationships between congregation members and the communities at risk. We can also see that beyond healthcare and beyond sanctuary, that relationships are vitally important when we consider the safety of members of at-risk communities. Both individual relationships, that connection, and the intentional congregation actions to make the religious community more welcoming. Think about the dreamers at risk of deportation. Think about the religiously and culturally marginalized groups, Muslim groups in particular, but now, most recently, we have to add Jewish groups as a community at risk. The GLBTQIA community. We seek to be a welcoming congregation here, and we're working on understanding what using the right pronouns means to people who are transgender. This is how we build relationships, both among us here in this congregation and to the wider GLBTQ community. Communities of color, very definitely at risk. Black Lives Matter, we have a sign on our building. But being in authentic relationship with people whose appearance puts them at risk is essential. And we can do this. I have been in relationship with 2 children of color since they were tiny. My daughter, Jamie, and my son, Kevin. Kevin is African American, and I was actually in the delivery room when he was born. I was the first person to hold him. And I feel deeply honored to be the mother of this child, and I'm conscious of the trust his birth mother placed in me. And when he was about 20 and we came out of a movie late at night, this was after Trayvon had been killed wearing his dangerous hoodie. We came out into the dark and cold of an almost empty parking lot. Our car was at the far end. We started to walk across, and it was freezing. And Kevin, quite naturally, flipped up his hood on his sweatshirt. So there he is, young black man wearing a hoodie. And I thought my heart was going to stop, because I thought, what if someone sees him in that hoodie and shoots him? And I thought, what can I do? And I didn't want to embarrass him, but I said, Kevin, I'm having a little difficulty walking in the dark. Take my arm, please. So he took my arm, and I proceeded to try to look as motherly and as white as possible, so that it would be clear that this young black man in the hoodie was in a relationship, a loving, supportive relationship with his elderly mother who needed a little help on the parking lot. Now, I don't know if it would have made a difference, but that's where my heart was. And I believe that each of us can find ways to be in authentic relationship with people who are at risk because of the way that they look. And I believe that our church community has a responsibility to find a way to build relationships outside these walls, to be allies to the communities that are most at risk. Relationships make a difference. And now the last area where I think relationships can and do help to make a difference. The world is filled with suffering, and the world is filled with overcoming. And that area is gun violence. Now we've seen the big public debate. For some reason, gun control is very difficult for Congress to enact, even when the vast majority of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, far and away support the idea of sensible limitations on putting rapid-fire automatic weapons into the hands of citizens. So maybe I can't solve that problem. Oh, I'll call my members of Congress, I'll write the letters, send the emails. But maybe I don't have control over that problem. But what I do control, what we as a church community control, is establishing relationships, supportive relationships with people. Stephen Paddock, the shooter in Las Vegas, had all the markers of those adverse childhood experiences. His father was a bank robber who was put in jail when he was 7, so there's the absent parent. His home was apparently filled with anger, so there's the abuse and possibly neglect. And there was an alcoholism in the family, so there's another. The markers are there, those adverse childhood experiences. We can't go back in time and save someone from their family of origin. But what we can do is reach out and establish relationships. And it's not always going to be possible, but my good friend, also a Unitarian Universalist minister, Joel Miller, was minister in the church in Columbine at the time of the shooting in the Columbine school. And as it happens, he doesn't talk about this much, because Joel is not the kind of person who toots his own horn. But one of the young men, there were 3 who were friends, who were stockpiling weapons and looking at videos and thinking about shooting people in school. And only 2 actually went and shot during that Columbine incident. The third one attended the Unitarian Church off and on. Joel established a relationship of trust with this youngster. He recognized the isolation and the alienation, and he reached out and got the young man involved in the youth group. And when the other boys took their guns and went to shoot up the school, that child did not go with them. Relationships are crucial to overcoming the suffering we see in the world. It was Helen Keller who wrote that life is filled with suffering, the world is filled with suffering, but it's also filled with overcoming. It's all around us. What we've survived and what others have survived, and the way that we grow and thrive, not just despite life's challenges, but sometimes because of them, because we heal stronger in the broken places. And it's about relationships. Positive relationships give us the power to overcome. Helen Keller certainly understood that. There she was, 2 years old, and she had a terrible fever that caused her to lose her eyesight and her hearing. And yet, she wasn't just a lone little Cheerio. She had other Cheerios in the dish who surrounded her and supported her and found her a teacher and helped her to overcome so that she learned to ride bicycles, she gave speeches, she even would go canoeing on a lake all by herself, feeling the direction by the wind on her face. Resilient, courageous, survivor of a bad experience in childhood, continuing physical damage going into adulthood, but she survived and came to overcome and thrive because of the positive relationships in her life. So this is a lesson for us as individuals to strengthen and cherish our relationships. It's a lesson for us as a church to encourage relationship building among us as we work to create a welcoming and supportive community together. And it's a lesson for us as justice makers to build authentic relationships outside our walls and act as allies to communities at risk. The world is filled with suffering. The world is also filled with overcoming.